And I would like to say welcome to all of you. My name is Jana Matuszak, and I'm so glad you're joining us tonight for an event organized in the context of, and I should say very generously funded by, the Being Human Festival, the UK's only national festival of the humanities, taking place across the country between the 12th and the 22nd of November this year. Being Human is run by the School of Advanced Study, University of London, in partnership with the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the British Academy. Events are of course mostly online this year, and you can see the full programme online at beinghumanfestival.org. The festival can also be found at Being Human Fest on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook, and the hashtag is BeingHuman2020. On behalf of the Festival Organising Committee, I'd like to ask you to help us keep as many festival events as possible free, and to improve the festival in years to come by taking a moment to fill in a short feedback survey at the end. Your feedback is incredibly valuable to us. Finally, if you'd like to help support the festival by making a donation, please go to beinghumanfestival.org/support-us. Thank you. I will put the links into the chat in case that was too fast. All right, let's start. My colleagues, Fran Hazelton, Badia Ubaid, and June Peters from the story collective Zipang, and I are very excited and honored to introduce you tonight to a very special text from ancient Mesopotamia. I will start with a bit of an introduction to the text in its ancient context, and then we will witness the world premiere of a brand new bilingual performance of this text in English and Arabic, breathing new life into an ancient text that was forgotten for nearly 4 millennia. Afterwards, we will welcome questions which you can put into the chat. We started preparations very early this year and had originally intended this to be a live event at SOAS University of London, where I am lecturer in ancient Near Eastern studies, but that was obviously not possible. Then we decided to turn this into a film, professionally recorded and produced by Richard Walding, who, sorry, I forgot to arrange my screen, co-founder of Eye on Heritage. But even the filming was impossible under the current circumstances. So we resorted to the one means of reaching you all from the safety of our homes, a Zoom webinar. Now, this may be far from ideal, and we do hope, fingers crossed, that the internet will not fail us tonight, but it is the best we can currently do. I must say this is also quite a departure for the Zipang team, and I'm very grateful to them for agreeing to give this format a try. However, the good news is that we are still passionately devoted to turning this into a film after all, once it's safe again to do so. And we wish to express our sincere gratitude to our sponsors and supporters, the London Centre for the Ancient Near East, the Institute of Classical Studies, the Royal Asiatic Society, the Enheruana Society, and of course, the Being Human Festival. Their financial support will not only cover the filming costs, but also enable us to include subtitles, so the film can be fully understood by both English and Arabic speakers. Unfortunately, a Zoom webinar doesn't currently allow subtitles in real time. So for our English speakers, there will be passages during the performance in Arabic that you will not understand, though I can assure you that our artists will make sure to get the point across nevertheless. It's really astonishing what sound and mimics can do. Conversely, English passages will be more difficult to understand for Arabic native speakers. The film will ultimately resolve this and unite us all in our common appreciation for the cultural heritage of Iraq. One of the things that we want to convey to you today is that it's both challenge and pleasure to engage with texts that are so incredibly old and seemingly extremely remote in time and space from our own lives. Yet it is incomparably rewarding as you discover that so many things never really changed and that we can still relate to the very human concerns expressed in these ancient compositions. The other thing I want to convey is that once you start engaging with a text, you may never stop. I've started working on this text that we're going to present in 2014, and it took me years to reconstruct and understand it. There are still a few gaps left, and perhaps one day I will find new manuscripts that will close these gaps, and I might then have to revise my entire interpretation, who knows. Possibly the most fun part of my personal engagement with this text was when I met the wonderful storytellers of Zipang at one of their performances, and we decided to tackle this new text, which is so unlike any other text in their repertoire. They, unlike me, can take some artistic liberties, which will make the text more accessible to modern audiences than any academic translation can ever aspire to. But their work is also ongoing, as is mine. They might change their minds on a couple of things or come up with an even catchier expression, keeping the ancient text alive in our imagination. It is my belief that a text is only ever truly dead once people stop engaging with it, and tonight will hopefully be a beginning. Are you a woman? If you heard this question being asked in English, you might perhaps turn your head to make out who's the speaker and who's being spoken to. Or if you were the one who's being addressed, you might draw your metaphorical knives ready to defend your honor, your identity, or your very own interpretation of womanhood. But depending on the situation, you probably wouldn't be terribly surprised that this question, as insulting as it potentially can be, is being asked at all. Conflicting opinions on what it means to be a woman are ubiquitous, and as we're going to explore for the next hour or so, they are as old as time. In fact, if you were walking the streets of Babylon around 4,000 years ago, you might hear exactly the same question, except in Sumerian. Uze'e munusmen? And it probably had a very similar ring to it. But before we go into the details of who asked this question, to whom, where and when, why and in what context, let me very briefly set the scene. What is Sumerian? Who were the Sumerians? And what do we know about Sumerian literature? We are in southern Mesopotamia, the land between the two rivers Euphrates and Tigris, in what is today Iraq, in a region roughly south of Baghdad. In antiquity, this region was called Sumer. Its inhabitants were called the Sumerians and their language Sumerian. They lived there from the 4th millennium BCE until around 2000 BCE and founded one of the world's earliest civilization. After 2000 BCE, we refer to this region as Babylonia. To give you just a bit of an idea about the very rich and diverse history of Mesopotamia and the role the Sumerians and Babylonians played in it, I've compiled a very few highlights for you. Writing was invented in Mesopotamia in the form of the cuneiform script in the late 4th millennium BCE. At the beginning of the 3rd millennium, textual sources are complex and informative enough to tell us that the political landscape of southern Iraq was characterized by different rivaling city-states, a bit like the polis in ancient Greece, who would for the first time be united into one empire around 2350 BCE. From that moment onwards, we essentially have a succession of empires with several gaps or political periods of political disorder in between. One of the names that you may have heard before is that of King Hammurabi, who is often accredited with commissioning the first law code, although there are in fact older models. He ruled from his capital Babylon in the 18th century BCE, which is actually the time period that interests us most today because this is when our text was circulating. A lot later was King Ashurbanipal, who ruled the Neo-Assyrian Empire from his capital Nineveh further up north, and left us, among many other things, his splendid royal library, which some of our London-based viewers may have admired in the British Museum exhibition in 2018. Both Hammurabi and Ashurbanipal would have spoken different dialects of Akkadian, which is a Semitic language related to Arabic, for example. This is because Sumerian, the dominant language of the 3rd millennium BCE, died out somewhere around 2000 BCE and was superseded by Akkadian as the official and everyday language. However, the fact that Sumerian was no longer spoken in everyday life after around 2000 BCE, this did not cause its complete extinction. Instead, it was taught at school as a dead but highly important and prestigious language from the early 2nd millennium BCE up until the turn of the eras. So Sumerian had a very similar status to that of Latin in the West. While the earliest literary texts written in the Sumerian language date to around 2600 BCE, texts continued to be transmitted and composed for over 2 millennia, and Sumerian continued to be a language of scholarship and religion. This appreciation for the Sumerian legacy explains why most Sumerian literary texts are actually preserved from the early 2nd millennium BCE. As Sumerian ceased to be a spoken language, a need was felt to preserve it, preserve knowledge of the language itself and of the literature composed in it. This process of preservation and transmission took place in private homes, which you see here outlined in different colors, where professional scribes educated a small number of apprentices who, just like our King Hammurabi, would have spoken Akkadian as their mother tongue. The teachers, equally native speakers of Akkadian, taught them the cuneiform script, which at this period looked something like this, as well as Sumerian grammar and vocabulary, along with the pronunciation of Sumerian words. And some of the most advanced students would proceed to study Sumerian literature, read the classics, so to speak. The way these advanced students would acquaint themselves with new literary compositions was to break them up into manageable chunks of 20 to 50 lines each, write them on several of such small tablets as the one you see on the screen, and only then write them, the entire text, down on one large single tablet with multiple columns. That explains why we have far more of these small excerpt tablets preserved than large tablets containing the entire text, because one would need between 4 and 8 of these excerpt tablets to write out a text of around 200 lines. Since students studied more or less the same texts across the entire Old Babylonian Empire over a period of several decades, we often have quite a substantial number of manuscripts for a given text from all over the place. And as I've tried to show on this slide, they're a bit of a hodgepodge. They contain local variants and scribal mistakes, and quite a number of them are pretty badly broken. That's why we usually have to reconstruct the texts from various bits and pieces, as we rarely ever have one manuscript containing one composition in its entirety. This giant puzzle is what makes reconstructing Sumerian literature challenging, but also very rewarding, because at the end of these broken pieces of clay stands a text that hasn't been read or recited by anyone in 4,000 years. The study of Sumerian literature wasn't limited to traditional texts of old, such as epics, myths, and hymns to gods. The teachers, most likely men, and we have to remember native speakers of Akkadian, also composed new Sumerian texts for their predominantly male students with decidedly pedagogic motifs in mind. And the text from which I've taken the quote, U ze'e munusmen, and you are a woman, is one of them. It is preserved on over 60 clay tablets from all over southern Iraq and western Syria, which are now spread over collections all over Europe, America, and Western Asia. I was able to reconstruct the text in its entirety, save for a few fragmentary lines, and it's my immense pleasure to introduce you to this fascinating composition just 3 days, I've heard, before the publication of my edition and analysis of the text. So what is this text? It is a literary disputation or verbal duel between two ordinary housewives who argue about who's the better woman. Now, that may sound banal, but the fact that ordinary women, housewives in fact, are the main protagonists is absolutely unique in Mesopotamian literature. Mostly literary texts feature gods or legendary kings of old, like Gilgamesh, and if they do feature human protagonists, it's usually people of very high rank. Therefore, this particular text gets us much closer to the lived experience of women 4,000 years ago than any other literary composition. Although, as I said, it was most likely written by men and hence represents their idea of a housewife's daily life. So we've got to bear in mind that although we will hear two women speaking, we won't hear their own voices, but their voices as imagined by highly educated men who were capable of composing texts in the prestigious dead language Sumerian. The plot is quickly paraphrased. Two female neighbors live in one of the many southern Mesopotamian cities. As you can see from those sections of the residential quarters of the early second millennium that have been excavated, people lived quite close to one another and privacy would have been rather limited. So it's not altogether surprising that quarrels between neighbors are frequently mentioned in proverbs and literature, but this is the only full-length text devoted to such a conflict. As it happens, a certain lady named Ninkuzu visits her neighbor, whose name is either not mentioned or lost in a tiny gap. I will call her Mrs. A for anonymous, but also because she's the first speaker in the text. Our Mrs. A is apparently not at all pleased about this visit. It may have been more of an intrusion really, and she greets Ninkuzu by asking rather aggressively, "Where are you coming from again?" After a rapid crossfire of mutual accusations and denigrations, they get ready to engage in a full-blown verbal contest, which reminds us a little bit of modern rap battles. Each of the two women holds 10 speeches in which they mock, provoke, and insult each other in sometimes very metaphorical and often very filthy language, full of rhythm, puns, and sound play, which sadly, but inevitably, always gets lost in translation. One of my favorite speeches in this regard is the following, which I'll recite in Sumerian for you. Asi aluluzi ar 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 ar, inus in turtur in ar ar ar, inindu ininbilbi ang shu dugani arashin numungar. Manipgigin? Here the speaker, our very eloquent Mrs. A, mocks her rival Ninkuzu for being so incredibly incompetent that she cannot even perform the most basic tasks, such as drawing water from a well or baking the daily bread. She particularly relishes the fact that Ninkuzu spends her entire day grinding grain. The arr, arr, arr imitates the sound of the grindstone, but also highlights how monotonous and strenuous the task is. But we learn after a lot of grinding, arr, arr, she burns the bread and all is for nothing. As you can see from this one single quote, the two women question each other's capability of being a good woman, their suitability for womanhood. This is particularly apparent from the frequently mentioned question, "Uze e munusmen?" And you are a woman, to which the implicit answer is, of course, no, you're not, you're doing it wrong. You can't even bake bread. The contest with these alternating speeches of the two rivals continues in this vein until Ninkuzu oversteps the boundaries of the initially rather playful, entertaining verbal exchange and utters a fateful accusation. In drastic language and stark images, she calls Mrs. A whore and accuses her of adultery. The whore! She keeps spreading lies in the brothel. Whenever she's married, she's instantly divorced again. She's a liar, pursuer of men. This vulva is being mounted. She's a mother giving birth on a daily basis. She's a dog raising its paw, always chasing after men. The young men living in the city quarter cannot sleep because of her. Now, this is an accusation that must not be uttered if you cannot prove it, as adultery is a capital crime in Babylonia at the time, and those who wrongly accused an innocent wife of adultery had also had to face harsh punishment. Mrs. A, of course, is outraged and quite possibly simply storms off as she says nothing in reply to Ninkuzu's last speech. Instead, she appeals to the authorities, the city assemblies of elders, and even the king himself, to clear her reputation and seek justice against her slandering rival. She has good cause to do so. Apparently, her husband heard of the accusation and the rumors arising from it and demanded a divorce, which Mrs. A obviously wants to prevent at all cost. The king is prepared to punish Ninkuzu for slander under one condition. He needs some sort of proof that it really was slander, that Ninkuzu consciously was spreading false information about her rival. But how do you prove your innocence if the very fact and the very act that you're accused of was by necessity committed in secret with no witnesses around? In such cases, where it was one person's word against another's and human wit came to an end, the Babylonians resorted to divine justice, which meant in practice that one of the parties had to swear an oath by a god. So they invited the deity in question to bring down a curse upon them lest they say anything but the truth. In our text, some further discussions and appeals by third parties complicate the matter, but the text is unfortunately rather fragmentary at this point. However, the end is again well preserved, and from that we learn that Mrs. A is willing to swear an oath to her innocence and thereby create a situation that the wicked Ninkuzu can be punished for her crime. A happy end at last. If we remember that this particular text was most likely written by teachers for their pupils in the early 2nd millennium BCE, then we can appreciate the didactic background of the text. Quite apart from the fact that the text was written in a foreign dead language and the didactic aspects inherent in that, the trial was in fact in the final third of the text would have taught students many things. It would have taught students procedural law, how to adjudicate such a complicated case as slander, where there is no witness and no proof. And we can in fact also observe that a number of paragraphs from the Code of Hammurabi, which I mentioned earlier, were being applied here. But last but not least, the text would also teach how to hold successful prosecution speeches and speeches for defense. And this leads directly to my next point. The entire text is in fact a lesson in rhetoric, which may be put to use at court, but of course also comes in handy in all sorts of other situations. Careful analysis and comparison with similar texts revealed that this text really juxtaposes one rhetorically proficient contestant, that's our Mrs. A, with a very poor speaker, our slandering Ninkuzu. In fact, her fateful, or perhaps just simply thoughtless, allegation of adultery is one of the many strategic blunders that Ninkuzu makes. And in general, she seems to compensate her lack of competence by means of wickedness. Contrasting a morally and professionally superior example with a decidedly inferior one is of course a very powerful didactic ploy and immediately wins over the audience for the winner. However, what may have been obvious to ancient readers of the text isn't necessarily obvious at all to a modern audience, as we have very different ideas of skillful and successful rhetoric. So let me explain how the Sumerian text works by giving you two contrasting examples. Let's have a look at the first two speeches. Mrs. A opens the verbal duel by a very well-structured speech, which seems to refer directly to Ninkuzu's intrusion in her home. She says, "Roaming the city, roaming the harbor, entering all houses. The house she entered, she took in possession. Of this house, she took over control. Spouse, she turned hostile towards spouse. Children, she wrested from their mothers. She instigated quarrel between the daughter-in-law and the mother-in-law. For this reason alone, you already stand defeated." In this speech, we can observe beautifully how the focus zooms in from the city to all houses and then fixes on one particular house where she instigates strife between the members of the household, with the married couple being at the very center of the stanza. Then the focus widens again and finally encompasses the in-laws at the periphery of the core family. Ninkuzu's short-tempered, insulting, hectic, and unstructured reply already marks her as the likely loser of the debate, although it has only just started. Ninkuzu shouts, "Robber of her own house, dog of her own trough, mongoose of her own basket," etc., etc., calling Mrs. A unflattering animal names, but not building a very carefully designed argument. These first two speeches would have already suggested to an ancient audience that Mrs. A is doing really well in this rhetorical contest, while Ninkuzu can only blurt out slurs, unable to utter a coherent speech. Now, we've seen that the text could teach both law and rhetoric, but that's not all. Above anything, it taught the characteristics of an ideal woman, which was envisioned really very much as an ideal wife. Looking at the content of the mutual insults and accusations uttered during this verbal contest, we can see that perfection in womanhood was dependent on four factors. There were certain character traits and modes of behavior that were expected, a certain social status, professional skills, as well as health and beauty. I will not go into any detail here because you can learn all these characteristics of an ideal wife from the performance, which I know you're all eagerly awaiting. Let me just point out that the character traits such as modesty, humbleness, diligence, and honesty were universal virtues expected from men and women alike. a respectable and well-off family background was equally universally appreciated, while bodily perfection in terms of a robust health and good looks were also deemed important for men and women alike. In fact, ideal men and women only differed with respect to professional competence. And from our text, we learn that our ideal woman should be competent in managing the household, taking good care of her husband in particular. She should be a good cook and skillful in providing her family with clothes. Now, none of this sounds very surprising or remote, does it? Considering that we have already seen that Mrs. A is the better speaker, it will not surprise you to learn that she's also presented as the better, more competent woman, at least according to the standards set by this text. By taking a closer look at who says exactly what to whom, we learn that Ninkuzu was totally incompetent when it came to managing the household and incapable of even very basic tasks such as baking bread, if you remember. More importantly, though, Ninkuzu is mocked for her infertility, while Mrs. A seems to have had many children. As it was desirable to have as many healthy children as possible, fertility was one of the most important characteristics of an ideal wife. This probably explains then why Ninkuzu is so terribly jealous of her rival that she quite forgets herself, flies into a rage, and utters her fateful incrimination. Coming back to the question of what it meant to be a woman 4,000 years ago, or what an ideal woman was supposed to be like, we will have noticed by now that the two rivals only ever accuse each other of doing things wrong. They never boast of doing it right themselves. So we actually never find a description or definition of the ideal woman, only ever of her exact opposite. This is quite common in Sumerian didactic literature, and by the way, also applies to the definition of ideal men. In other words, when teachers gave advice to their pupils, there were far more don'ts than do's for everyone, regardless of sex or gender. What is telling, however, is that only Mrs. A ends many of her speeches with the rhetorical question, "And you're a woman?" indicating that she highly doubts that Ninkuzu can in fact be reckoned among women, given the countless things that she keeps doing wrong. Ninkuzu tries to counter this by snapping back, "Are you a person?" Which, well, from our perspective, one might think tops the question of Mrs. A by being more universal. However, it appears that in this context, the question more specifically geared towards perfection and womanhood seems superior to the vaguer one, as the debate is not about how to be a good person, but very specifically about how to be a good woman. Bearing in mind the criteria which I mentioned earlier, such as a virtuous character, good family background, professional competence, and physical flawlessness, we are left with the impression that only a woman who ticked all boxes deserved to be called a woman at all. Now that we've already seen that there's quite some drama going on, with an originally relatively playful quarrel getting out of hand, involving serious incriminations which can only be resolved at court, however, there are several indications that the text was indeed intended as a real drama, or like a miniature theatre play. The original Sumerian text knows no narrative passages whatsoever. It consists of only direct speech with no narrator involved. When reading it, it feels a bit like reading the script for a play without stage directions, which gave and gives the actors ample room for improvisation. We can in fact think of the text as a drama in 3 acts, with the initial encounter of the two antagonists getting fired up for the actual contest as the exposition. The contest in the main part leading up to the dramatic climax when Ninkuzu calls Mrs. A whore, and the solution of the conflict in the form of a trial. So if you have believed up to this point that the Greeks invented theatre, I can assure you that the Sumerians and Babylonians have been doing this at least since the late 3rd millennium BCE. While the first two acts exclusively focus on the two antagonists, several other people get involved in the resolution, such as the elders and the king as the supreme judge. But the invisible presence of an audience is also felt in the main part, as contrary to what you'd expect, the two contestants hardly ever address each other directly. Rather, they inform the audience of the many things their respective opponent is doing wrong. Let's look at Mrs. A's mocking speech quoting at the very beginning again. She's saying about Ninkuzu, drawing water, muddying water, grinding flour non-stop. She pounded the grain, she shredded it, she ground it for a very long time. She baked the bread and burned it completely. Whatever she touches, she ruins completely. Can you reply anything at all to that? For 4 entire lines, Mrs. A is describing the incompetence of Ninkuzu to someone else. And you can just imagine how Mrs. A, facing the audience, keeps pointing her finger at Ninkuzu, rolling her eyes and sneering at how ridiculously clumsy she is. Only in her very last line does Mrs. A turn to Ninkuzu directly, simultaneously indicating that her speech has ended and inviting her opponent to fire back. So I imagine this to have been a very lively performance in antiquity, which actively involved the audience, inviting them to judge both the characters and, I suppose, the performers. Therefore, I can barely hide my excitement that in a few minutes, we will witness the world premiere of the first ever performance of this text in about 4,000 years. Not in the Sumerian original, as that would be slightly difficult to understand, but in English and Arabic. So let the virtual curtain rise for Zipang. Please join me in welcoming June Peters.
Hello, everyone. My name's June Peters, and I'm one of the Zipang trio of Mesopotamian storytellers. Zipang is the Sumerian word for breath, and the Zipang storytellers breathe new life into the long-lost stories of ancient Iraq, Mesopotamia. The other two Zipang storytellers are Badia Obaid and Fran Hazelton, and Fran and Badia will be performing the short Sumerian play translated by Dr. Jana Matuszak and soon to be published. Now, as Dr. Matuszak has said, it's about a dispute between two women, and like a modern rappers battle, the women compete to outdo each other in eloquent language. Fran and Badia will perform in a mixture of English and Arabic. And for those of you who don't understand Arabic, I'm afraid there are no subtitles, but as Jana said, we are going to make a film which will have both English and Arabic subtitles. And for tonight, I will be the narrator, setting the scene for you and telling you the story as we go through the play. Oh, also, I'm going to be the king in the last act, the king who is the judge. So, on behalf of Zipang, I'd like to thank Dr. Jana Matuszak for the opportunity to work with her on this wonderful play that she's translated, and now we perform after 4,000 years. We also would like to thank the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, and the organisers of the Being Human Festival for including our performance in the festival programme. So, without more ado, let the play begin. Imagine that you are in a family courtyard somewhere in ancient Sumer. In the distance, you can hear the sound of children playing. Here in the courtyard, something smells tasty. There's a pot bubbling on the outside oven, and the housewife, who has just finished supervising the cooking, is tidying up ready for the meal. This is Mrs. A. She's the competent mother, wife, and keeper of this household. Mrs. A is mature, well-dressed, dignified, attractive. She's a woman at the height of her powers. Mrs. A finds that she is facing a neighbour who has just come in through the courtyard door. This is Ninkuzu. These two women don't get along. They have had words before.
ننكزو في باحة الدار؟ لماذا أنت هنا؟ أنت مرة أخرى. من أين أتيت؟ ماذا تريدين؟ ولماذا أنت هنا؟ ها؟
She says, yes, it is me again. Don't start a quarrel with me again. If you quarrel with me, as you know, your words can't beat my words. You will not win in a quarrel with me.
طبعا أبدأ معك كي أصون شرفي وسمعتي. ولكن قولي لي ماذا فعلت لك؟ ها؟
You asked me, what have you done to me? Well, when you quarrelled with me before, you quarrelled viciously. I gave you as good as I got, but I still can't sleep because of your words.
كاذبة، تكذبين، كلامك فيه افتراء. انتبهي لما تقولين.
You call me a liar and say my words are slanderous, but you are the liar.
عندما تكذبين بهذه الطريقة، هذا دليل أمام الجميع أنني أفضل منك.
The better person? You think you are a better person than me? You think you can compete with me? You are not my equal. Don't try to look down at me or talk down to me. You are at the bottom of the pile. There is nobody lower than you.
قد تكونين على قدر من الجمال، ولكن مهما حاولتي، مهما فعلتي، مهما تجملتي، لن يساعدك هذا في شيء. في نهاية الأمر أنا سأنتصر.
Yes, I have my good looks and I know how to use them. You are a nobody. You are the slave girl of the neighborhood. Everybody uses you and you are a terrible cook.
Oh dear. Oh, now the trouble begins. Mrs. A and Ninkuzu are equals. They're equals in social role and social class. And there's competition between them about who is the better housewife. They're both full-time housewives and there's jealousy there. But while Mrs. A has all the qualities of being a competent and respectable housewife, Ninkuzu just doesn't. Also, Mrs. A has more children and Ninkuzu is jealous. This antagonism has been simmering for a while, and now it's about to bubble over into the public arena. In the city square, in front of all their peers, each woman will attempt to prove her superiority over the other. And this will be her superiority in the skills of housekeeping, but also in the rules of verbal dispute. Each woman will try and prove she's the better woman and the better speaker, more eloquent and articulate. As we watch this dispute, we are watching just as the apprentice scribes of Sumer watched 4,000 years ago. And like those young boys, we're learning. We're learning the rules of verbal dispute, and we're learning what it was to be a good woman in ancient Sumer. The scene is now the city square, and many of the townsfolk have already gathered to hear the dispute between Mrs. A and Ninkuzu. And the two women are getting ready to set out their arguments, worded as eloquent attacks and insults on the other. And the audience will decide who is the winner.
لا يكفيها أنها تتجول في ساحات المدينة، في الميناء، هي في كل مكان، تدخل كل البيوت. لا، والبيت الذي تدخله يصبح كأنه ملك لها. بسببها اشتدت الخلافات بين الجميع، بسببها اشتد الخلاف بين الزوج والزوجة، وفي غفلة منهما سرقت الطفل الذي كان في حضن أمه، وشعلت الخلافات بين الزوجة وحماتها، وبدأت المشاكل في كل بيت دخلته. الجميع يعرف أنها الآن في حكم المذنبة. ننكوزو، أنت الآن في حكم المذنبة.
She says I committed crimes. Well, let me tell you, she is a thief. She stole fish from the fishmongers. Yes, stole, I said. Look at her hands, they are fish blood red. She is a thieving mongoose. Like a dog, she will eat anything from anywhere. She doesn't care what it is or who owns it. She steals from the storehouse. She steals from the slaves. When she was a bride and she moved into her husband's house, she didn't take a spindle to make clothing for themselves. No, she took a ladder, so she could steal from high up shelves. That upset you, didn't it, Mrs. A?
معروفة، هي معروفة، تسخر من الآخرين أمام الجميع في الساحات العامة، ولكن هذا يكشف عن شخصيتها، مثل صعلوك صغير يسخر منه الجميع. لكنها الآن ستعرف معنى العار، ستشعر بالعار عندما يتم نتف نصف شعرها، عندما تفرك شفتيها بالملح، عندما تجلد على ظهرها وعلى مؤخرتها. الجميع يعرف أنها الآن مذنبة. ننكوزو، أنت الآن مذنبة، ها؟
She says I am already convicted. Well, today I caught her in the act. She was holding in her hands and eating a piglet she had stolen. At night, she creeps around eating the food she has stolen. Her mouth, so big and swollen, is full of cake she has taken from the oven. With her mouth so big and swollen, she can't stop herself eating the food she has stolen. But she won't shut up. With your big mouth so full and swollen, full of food you have stolen, you can't reply to me, can you, Mrs. A?
لو تحدثنا عن الطعام، هي معروفة بشراهتها، بفمها الكبير تلتهم الحساء دفعة واحدة، ليس شرهة فقط وإنما مبذرة في الزيت، في الطحين. والأدهى من ذلك أنها لا تعرف كيف تشعل النار، هل الحطب أولا أم القش، وكأن ليس لديها بيت وليس لديها أسرة، لا بل أن ثياب زوجها رثة بالية. ننكوزو، على ماذا أنت متغطرسة وسمعتك سيئة؟ ها؟
She says I'm no good as a housewife. Well, she is like a slave or a pauper with her endless housewife toil. She is forever roasting barley, forever pressing oil, forever baking loaves of bread, which are ridiculously huge. And all her housework is for show, because it lets everybody know that she was born so very low. She is the daughter of a pauper who is now a woman nobody trusts and everybody looks down upon. You are forever doing, Mrs. A, aren't you? What will you be doing next? Climbing through windows looking for men, eh, Mrs. A?
حسناً، لنتحدث بخصوصية أكثر. نتحدث عن المرأة، عن الأنوثة، عن الخصوبة، عن إنجاب الأطفال. أنت كامرأة انتهيت، لا خصوبة ولا أنوثة ولا مقدرة على الإنجاب، وهذا خراب لبيتها. طبعا هي تدعي وفرة 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 وهي لا تملك حتى لترا من الشعير في بيتها، وهذا ما يؤذي الأسرة عندما تخرج وتشرب البيرة هنا، تأكل الطعام الجاهز هنا، بينما ثيابها وثياب زوجها رثة بالية ممزقة. لا، بل أن الجميع رأى مؤخرتها من ثقوب ثوبها. ننكوزو، هل أنت امرأة؟ ها؟
She says I am not a woman. Well, she is not a person. She is forever scorning women and forever slighting men. She slanders everybody. Wherever she treads, she beats our heads with both her fists. She is forever hostile, forever telling lies, forever causing trouble wherever she can. Her house is more like a tavern than a comfortable home for a man. You're not a person, are you, Mrs. A?
كارثة، مصيبة بائسة، لا تستطيع عمل شيء واحد وتنتهي منه. عندما تذهب لجلب الماء تأتي بالطين والوحل، عندما تبدأ بطحن الحبوب في كل مكان لا تعرف متى تتوقف، أما عندما تخبز الخبز تحرقه بالكامل، يتلبسها الشر. أي شيء تلمسه يداها تدمره بالكامل. ننكوزو، هل يمكنك أن تردي على ما قلت؟ ها؟
She says there are things which I can't do. Well, she with her slow hands can't do anything at all. She can't comb wool and she can't spin it. Her lack of womanly skills has no limit. When she makes a social visit, she leaves as soon as she arrives. Outside in the street, she insults everybody non-stop. Then after, when the assembly says flog her, she says, I will be the judge of that, and finishes shamelessly with laughter. This is my insult to you, isn't it, Mrs. A?
شاهد زور، هي شاهد زور، تقول شيئا وتفعل عكسه. شخصيتها متناقضة، طبعا متناقضة، لا يمكن الاعتماد عليها، لا يمكن الوثوق بها. لماذا؟ أنا أقول لكم لماذا. لأنها تكره كل من يأخذ حقه بالقانون، تكره القوانين، هي ضد الإنسانية. قد تبدو قلقة، قد تبدو في حيرة، كأنها تبحث عن شيء ما، ولكن العجيب الغريب أنها لا تمانع من أن تبيع نفسها حتى لرجال القانون كي تنال ما تريد، ولا تمانع من أن تدفع رشوة كي يدعونها تذهب لحال سبيلها. ننكوزو، هل تحسبين نفسك امرأة من جنس النساء؟ هل أنت امرأة؟ ها؟
She says I am not a woman. Well, as I said already, she is not a person. She is a ladle and a jug pouring soup and serving beer, not only for her own family. She is the cook for the whole neighborhood. She strides into other people's houses and bosses with her big mouth, cleaning the house and frightening the family. You can't have that, she tells them. That belongs to me. See, you are not a person, are you, Mrs. A?
بيتها بلا باب، ولكم أن تتخيلوا بيت بلا باب. بيتها حظيرة الخنازير، ليس لديها غرفة نوم، تنام قرب الفرن، والفرن طبعا في فناء الدار. هي ولدت بين الخدم، هي ليس ولدت فقط بين الخدم، وإنما زوجها عبد خادم. هي من بيت بناه العبيد وأسسته الخادمات. والآن قولي لي يا ننكوزو، أي كائن أنت؟ هل أنت من جنس النساء؟ هل أنت امرأة حقا؟ ها؟
She says I am not a woman. Well, she is a lunatic, sad, bad, and absolutely mad. She is an imbecile with the evil eye. However she might try, she can't look me in the eye. Her mouth is twisted and curvy. She turns everything topsy-turvy. She is a mad dog, a killer hog from the wild, a restless, show-off bastard child. People flee from her. She is a gossip and a telltale with the hairstyle of a slave. All the words from her mouth are trash. You can't match my words, can you, Mrs. A?
دائما تجدها في زاوية الشارع، في زاوية الزقاق، تجلس على عتبات البيوت لتستمع ماذا يجري في الداخل حتى تبدأ المشاكل بين الجيران. تتلصص على الآخرين، ليس حبا في معرفتهم، لا، وإنما لتجد موضوعا للنقاش، للثرثرة، للنفاق، للإشاعات، لإشاعة المشاكل. بسببها لا أحد يعرف الراحة. أنت ماذا يا ننكوزو؟ هل أنت امرأة؟ قولي، هل أنت امرأة؟ ها؟
She says I'm not a woman. Well, she can't compete with me for sure. And there is more. She destroys houses. She destroys the city. She turns up again and again and again. It is not nice to see her tear her hair, which is itching with lice. Her tongue hangs out, and she is so skinny she looks as if she is starving. Her beer is thin as well, and her bed is so low you can't sit on it. At the market, she's a cheat in it, robbing both buyers and sellers, rabble-rousing, telling lies to the city boys and girls alike, so they can't sleep at night. You can't compete with me, can you, Mrs. A?
انظروا واسمعوا لما تقول. لقد أفسدت الحوار، أفسدت النقاش بصراخها وصوتها البشع وثرثرتها. ثرثرتها لا قيمة لها ولا معنى، لا تعرف شيئا سوى الأكل والشرب، والفم يدور لا يتوقف، والبحث عن الموبقات والرذائل. وجه الشر شريرة أنت، شريرة حتى في بيتها. شكلها ينطق بهذا. ننكوزو، إلى متى ستستمرين في هذا؟ ها؟
She asks me how much longer do I want to carry on with this. Well, she can't compete with me. See how ugly she is. She looks like a slave girl with the ugly face of an old hag. Her head is big and square with no hair, no hair, no hair, no hair. Her husband is in despair because of her bulging, blinking eyes, her skinny nose and her swollen mouth. She is so ugly. You can't compete with me, can you, Mrs. A?
وجه الشر أنت، لا تستحقي أن تكوني امرأة. لم تحقق شيئا في حياتها. ثم انظري إلى وجهك الشاحب، بلا حياة، وجه بلا حياة، شاحب. رقبتك غليظة مترهلة الثديين، بطنها منتفخة. الورك طويل والأرداف مشوهة، سيقانها متورمة، القيح يسيل منها من كل مكان، رائحتها نتنة عفنة، عقيمة لا يمكنها الإنجاب، غيورة لا يمكنها الإنجاب، رحمها مغلق، لا، والأدهى من ذلك أن الشعر الطويل ليس على كتفيها وإنما بين فخذيها. اسمعيني جيدا، اسمعيني جيدا، لم تخلق بعد المرأة التي تقف وتتشاجر معي، وإن خلقت يا ننكوزو فلن تكوني أنت.
She says I can't compete with her. Well, she is a poor whore, telling lies in a tavern. She tells lies and chases men. The young men of the city can't sleep because of her. The men she chases can't be counted. Her vulva is forever mounted. She gets married one day, then the next day gets divorced. She gives birth to a baby every day. She is a begging dog with a lifted paw. A whore, a whore. Yes, and an adulteress. You are a whore and an adulteress, aren't you, Mrs. A?
ماذا قلتي؟ مومس وزانية؟ لا، لا، هذا الكلام لا يمكن السكوت عليه. أراك في المحكمة ننكوزو.
And with that, Mrs. A rushes off in anger. Meanwhile, Ninkuzu smiles round at the townsfolk. Ninkuzu has had the last word in this verbal dispute, and the rules of verbal dispute in Sumer are clear. If you get the last word, you're the winner. So you might think that Ninkuzu is the winner.
Yay!
But you'd be mistaken, because there are higher rules in ancient Sumer. If you're a woman, for you, adultery is a crime punishable by death. In a verbal dispute, you can say pretty much anything to insult a woman who's your equal, but you can't say that. You can't call her a whore and an adulteress. And that's exactly what Ninkuzu has done. So now this dispute must go to the legal level. There must be a court case. There must be a trial. At that trial, Ninkuzu has to substantiate the allegations that she's just made against Mrs. A, that she's a whore and an adulteress, or she's going to be in trouble. Also, Mrs. A must prove her innocence, or she's going to be in trouble. The scene is now the king's court. The king will preside. He will be the judge. There's the hum and chatter as courtiers and servants and attendants take their places to await the coming of the king. Here he is now. Who is the complainant?
أنا سيدي.
And what is your complaint?
سيدي، أنا وهي متساويتان. بيتي مثل بيتها، زوجي مثل زوجها، أطفالي مثل أطفالها. نعم، تشاجرنا، أهانتني وأهنتها، لكنها يا سيدي تجاوزت كثيرا، تجاوزت ووصفتني بأوصاف لم أسمعها من قبل. وصفتني بالمومس والزانية، وأنا لا أعرف شخصا غير زوجي. بسببها زوجي طلقني وتحطمت حياتي. وصفتني بأوصاف يعاقب عليها القانون، وأنا لا أعرف رجلا غير زوجي. زوجي هو الرجل الوحيد في حياتي. سيدي، أنتظر منك الحكم العادل.
And who is this woman who is your equal, who has called you a whore and an adulteress and caused your husband to divorce you?
إنها ننكوزو ابنة لو قال نرجال.
Are you Ninkuzu?
I am Ninkuzu.
And did you call Mrs. A a whore and an adulteress, causing her husband to divorce her?
My lord, Mrs. A and I had a proper verbal dispute in front of witnesses. We competed in insulting each other. When she insulted me, I didn't take it to heart, but when I insulted her, she was dumbstruck. Because she was speechless, she went to the extreme of taking me to court, putting me on trial. My lord, grant me a fair verdict.
If I grant you a fair verdict, Ninkuzu, you will pay the divorce fee, which is 1/3 of a mina of silver. Yes, 1/3 of a mina of silver. Also, your back and your bottom will be flogged with 6 lashes.
Ooh.
Half your hair will be shaved, and your mouth and lips will be rubbed with salt, and then the herald will announce your punishment to the whole city square. And then perhaps, Ninkuzu, you will never again call a woman who is your equal a whore and an adulteress. And you, Mrs. A? You must swear an oath. Before the God of justice, you must swear that you are not a whore and an adulteress. And with that, the king dismissed all the people. As soon as the townsfolk were out of earshot of the king and his servants, a big discussion started up about the case. Some said this and some said that. Mrs. A should not have to swear an oath. Ninkuzu should not have to be flogged. Ninkuzu should not have called Mrs. A whore and an adulteress. It was Mrs. A who started the whole row. Now, the one who gets the last word is Mrs. A. She's going to talk straight to all the townsfolk, and these are the words she's going to say. When Ninkuzu came to my courtyard, all I said was, "You again? What are you doing here again? Why are you here?" We had a proper verbal dispute, and in that dispute, Ninkuzu insulted me a lot. Ninkuzu said things about me that have never been said about me before, and as a result of it, my husband divorced me. Here in front of the God of justice, I swear that I am not a whore and an adulteress. My husband is the only man in my life. Ninkuzu should be punished for the things she said about me, punished in court. In front of the God of justice, the evil woman will be punished. And now the last words go to Mrs. A as she concludes our play.
كل ما قلته لها عندما رأيتها في باحة داري: أنت مرة أخرى من أين أتيت؟ لماذا أنت هنا؟ ماذا تريدين هذه المرة؟ تشاجرنا، نعم، أهانتني وأهنتها، ولكنها تجاوزت كثيرا هذه المرة، تجاوزت كثيرا ووصفتني بأوصاف لم أسمع بها من قبل. وصفتني بالمومس والزانية، بسببها زوجي طلقني، تحطمت حياتي. وأنا لا أعرف في حياتي رجلا غير زوجي. زوجي هو الرجل الوحيد في حياتي. وصفتني بأوصاف يعاقب عليها القانون. مهما كان حكم القانون، إله العدل حاضر بيننا. إله العدل، أنصفني وعاقب المرأة الشريرة، عاقب ننكوز الشريرة. أنصفني إله العرب، أنصفني، أنصفني.
Applause!
Thank you.
I know we can't hear any of our participants, but I'm sure they're applauding just as loud as I've just done. So let this stand for everyone's round of applause. That was absolutely brilliant. I think I should tell the audience that this was better than the original. All right, we've reached the end of our official program, but we anticipate that you might have a question. I have not really had an eye on the discussion and in the chat so far. So if you do have any questions that you would like to ask any of us, you could ask me about the text, you could ask the performers of how they set about to make this text their own, how they adapted it into both English and Arabic, what difficulties they might have been facing, or how we were working together to create this performance. Maybe I'll start with one question that I see in the Q&A. So there was one question whether, I suppose I think, the original performers would have been women or men. That's a really good question. I think they would have been men for one reason. As I've tried to explain in my talk, at this period, when this text was possibly both composed and studied by schoolboys within their kind of scribal education, ordinary people, including housewives, would have no longer understood Sumerian. Sumerian at that time was really understood by a kind of educated class of scribes. And from all we know, they were predominantly male. That doesn't say that the occasional women didn't participate in that. We do know that women were able to read and write, but it depends a bit on how far they went in their education. And even most boys would stop after they're able to write contracts and letters and things necessary to do business. Not all boys even would go on to study Sumerian literature. And so far, we don't have any direct evidence that girls learned anything about Sumerian literature. So a general audience at that time possibly would not have been capable of following a play in Sumerian. Those who would have been able to understand are those that go to school and learn Sumerian literature. So I imagine, because the text is essentially written to educate boys, that it was boys who performed the play. And I can imagine that this also made it a lot more funny, because you would have 2-3 boys on stage who were pretending to be women. There might have even, this is pure speculation, some aspect of cross-dressing, and they might have had quite some fun with that text, but we do not know for certain if this was ever performed. So another possibility is that they were reading this text like we're reading Shakespeare plays without going to the theatre. That's possible. There is a question from Molly, aged 8. That's really nice, Molly, for asking this question. How long did it take you to work out what the tablet says? Well, that took me quite some time. I first had to learn to read cuneiform, which takes a couple of years. I had to learn Sumerian as well, which is a rather difficult language. And the text itself, it took me about a year. So the most fun part was traveling around the world to look at the different manuscripts. And then it's a lot of research in the library, but I think about a year. And then one thing I maybe should say, because I kept saying that this performance was better than the original, which I really do believe. After I had translated the text, I still didn't fully understand it. Because the text, we have to admit, is very different from what we are used to as literature. Someone writing this in the 21st or 20th century would have approached this very differently, and we don't have the same kind of lively tradition of, disputes between housewives, or maybe this is a thing on YouTube I should check. So analyzing the text has really helped to understand it, and that took another year. And I just quote the question: is there an Akkadian translation of this text? I'm sorry if you already answered this in your introductory lecture, which I didn't. And the person is also curious if I think that people memorize this text. So these are two different things. Yes, there is an Akkadian translation, which is very unusual. We have quite a substantial corpus within the wider context of Sumerian literature that is devoted to these rhetorical contests, these verbal duels. We've got very diverse protagonists, not just women, also men, but also normally inarticulate entities like summer and winter, bird and fish. So they really like this kind of antagonism acted out on stage. And the text that we presented tonight is the only one for which there exists an Akkadian translation, which seems to suggest that it was quite popular. And at the same time, they were so interested in the content that it was not just about teaching students Sumerian, there was also something else worthy of being written down. It's not a complete Akkadian translation, but we have 4 manuscripts out of 60, I should say, which are both written in Sumerian and Akkadian, but none of them are complete. So we don't have a complete Akkadian version for this text. But maybe for the future, it would be interesting to look at the Akkadian texts more closely when working on an Arabic translation of it to see if it's possible to align it a bit. And as regards memorizing texts, yes, I think that's what they did. I think they memorized all texts that they studied at school. Sometimes the particular mistakes that they make in writing their homework result from incorrect memory. So I think they did memorize the text. I'm sure they had fun with it. Someone would like to be reminded of how many lines of text and where it was found. So the text has 230 lines in total, which is medium length as far as Sumerian literature is concerned. And it was found in many different places. The majority of the manuscripts was found in the ancient city of Nippur. That is the case for most of Sumerian literature, in fact, because there we have excavated schools, private houses, where thousands of tablets were found in one single house alone. But we also have manuscripts from all sorts of other places across southern Iraq. What's striking is that this particular text was even found in places where it's very rare to find Sumerian literature. So even in very kind of provincial places, they studied this text and practically no other Sumerian literary text. That's how it looks like. Obviously, they probably did, and the others are just not preserved or haven't been excavated. But it does look like this text was very popular in antiquity already. For an audience, may I ask a question? Because the way we've done this, I've given my English translation to them, and I tried to be very hands-off and say, you do something with it, and it's your piece. So one thing I couldn't help but notice is that you introduced a narrator, which doesn't, there is no narrator in the original text. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on your choice, why you decided to introduce a narrator in your performance.
Well, can I speak?
Yeah.
Because one of the issues around that was because we were going to do it as a bilingual text, and Fran and I have done a few bilingual texts before, but mainly done them as stories. So the story can carry. You can do it in such a way as that even though we're speaking English and Arabic, You can repeat what's happening in the story and build on the story, and only use sort of dialogue when the dialogue's clear and people can understand it. But there's no way that this text would work in that way. So I certainly felt that that there were things that the audience needed to know that they could not know, without having it explained. I also felt a sort of responsibility towards your intentions, Jana. I know you said we had a free hand, but still there was a sort of responsibility to you, and there were certain things that you wanted in there, like the sense that this was written by men. These were supposedly women's words, but they're clearly men's words, and just other issues like that were very, very difficult to sort of represent just through the dialogue, the dialogue as it was set. So that was one of the reasons. What do you feel, Fran and Badia?
I think it also was partly because of your particular storytelling background, and rather than being in a play, So it worked. I think it worked all right. We just felt there was a need for a narrator, didn't we?
I absolutely agree. I mean, I really think it was fantastic.
Yeah, also the narrator like leading the story, and from Act 1 to Act 2 to 3, then the king, the audience, and the square. This is very, hold the whole play.
Yes, and also that if you don't have the sort of background that Jana has, Fran has, that we've built up over the years of that we know what the historical context was. If you don't know that historical context, then it's just nice to have that. That isn't in it.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's one of the difficulties with this genre, that there is a certain plot, there is a certain dramatic development. You can just read it in the dialogue, but it's not really explained. The scene isn't set. The antagonists aren't being introduced. We only learn the names of the two antagonists in the final third of the text, right? We learn these names even very late. So I absolutely agree it was necessary to introduce this narrator to make it work for a modern audience. There is another question for Badia. And she's interested in the process you went through to portray the character of Mrs. A. When you read the script, did you find it difficult to understand the emotions of the character? Did you bring your own interpretation to the table, or stick solely to how Mrs. A seemed to feel?
It wasn't easy in the beginning because like a plain, no taste, no flavor, but because my background is theater, I work with the each sentences and try to put my experience as well in the text. And it isn't, of course, I'm not a translator, but I did my best.
There's some other question about Zipang. Is Zipang comprised of actors or other performers? And did you audition for your parts?
Oh no, can I say a bit here? Yeah, that's a bit too grand for us. No, it was June and me and Fiona, who lives in Wales now, but she might be coming in. No, we've been doing this a long time, many years ago. And it was basically June's a storyteller, and so is Fiona, telling lots of stories from all different cultures. But when I got interested in the ancient Iraq and studied with the Andrew George, I linked up with June and Fiona because I just saw there was all this material that's there in academic translations, which wasn't being performed, you know, which wasn't being presented to the public. So it's coming from the storytelling tradition to use the material. Okay, over to you, June, if you like.
So the short answer is no, we didn't audition because it's just us. And
Exactly, yeah.
And what happened was that Jana saw Badia and Fran and I performing, and Fran was doing a short a comic story on her own, but Badia and I were doing a dialogue. And Jana pounced on us and said, "Oh, this is perfect for my play." We too started to work on it, and pretty soon I realised I was out of my depth, and but really enjoyed trying to work on the text. Fran then read it, and what she actually said to me on the phone was, "June, I read your text, and my heart sank."
I didn't say
that. But then she said, because you are a storyteller, not an actor, and this requires somebody to learn a part. And why don't I come in on with it? And I was just delighted because and so I took over the narrator's role then, and Fran then sort of completed the text and rehearsed it with Badia. I don't know if it's appropriate for me to say that the part of the reason that I thought that Badia should play Mrs. A was part of the sort of historical, political relationship of sort of like, you know, of Iraq and Britain, and I didn't think that it would be right for me to play, or for an English speaker to play the part at one at the end.
But just to say, I mean, it was, you know, the original, there is the academic translation by Jana, which is I was going to say the beginning of it all. No, the beginning of it all is the stuff on the clay tablets. Then the next stage is when it's available in English and translated by Jana. And then we're very cheeky, you know, we just get these academic translations and we go from there, you know, but we improvised a lot. We made things up. The one thing I think we did was Jana pointed out this important thing that when they're in the dispute, when the two women are making their speeches, they're not making them really to each other, they're saying them to the public, and then once they make their speech to the public or to the audience, and then they turn round and they finish off with a sort of punchline to each other. And we realized it was very important to keep that as a format of it, you know. But we then have now developed a script. There's nothing to, well, I suppose in theory, other people could use the script, you know.
And also, this is very good experience doing this play on Zoom, which is really adventure. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Emir, for asking the last question, and thank you all for your patience and your very, interesting questions. I'm really happy that you were engaging with this so actively, and I thank the Zipang performers for a magnificent premiere of putting this text back on stage and breathing new life into it. I really do believe this was marvelous and quite possibly, well, I can't speak for ancient performances, but better than I could have imagined it myself. Thank you very much, everyone. And I'd be very grateful if you could leave your feedback at the end in the survey form. And do follow up on the various enterprises of the Zipang team. They've got their own website. So you can listen to their recordings, and there are some YouTube clips, and at some point next year, there'll be a movie, so watch out for that as well. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.